Okay, I think we can get going. So Ashley, thank you so much for being our DJ in addition to all the different logistical amazing things you do for us. And hi, and a warm welcome to all of you. Welcome to back to season 5 of the Democracy Dialogues. I'm your host, Victoria Couquettes. It's great to be back for another session to discuss some of the most persistent challenges to Canadian democracy. And for those of you who have participated in past sessions, welcome back. It's great to see you. And for anyone newly joining us, thanks for being here and a warm welcome. So, as our invite shared, we're here to look at the impact of loneliness and its impact on our democracy. And as many of you will know, the Toronto Foundation recently released its annual vital signs report. And one of the central challenges facing our city, and I think our nation more broadly, is the loneliness epidemic, which signals a lack of connection, cohesion, and community. And, the report asks, how can we get back to being a city of neighbors? Which is exactly the question we're here to explore today. So we know that people are reporting economic challenges, which is a barrier to gathering. And more broadly, people are still emotionally, psychologically, and quite frankly, spiritually still recovering from the pandemic, which no one actually wants to talk about anymore and everybody wants to forget, but it's still haunting all of us. So many are feeling socially awkward. There are a ton of barriers to meaningful community participation, some old, and as the report teaches us, some new as well. So what can we do? Some questions I want to explore today with our guests are social structures and institutions responding to 2024 realities? Is inflation not just killing our pocketbooks, but our ability to connect with one another? Is polarization and social pressures on and offline creating fault lines that keep us apart and lonely? And how can we, as community builders, as many of us are on the call are today, how can we create tools and strategies that inspire the kind of connection and deepen the kind of relationships we're all seeking? All of these issues seriously challenge our democracy, our ability to make decisions together, to communicate with one another, and ultimately thrive as a society. So I'm ready to roll up my sleeves and do the work. And we have the two very best guests here to do that with us. I'm going to ask all of you to work alongside us too, because that's actually our only hope. So first, let's connect in with one another. I'd love to have all of you introduce yourselves to me and to one another as well, so we can start those neighborly connections. So if you can use that chat function to share your names and which organizations you're from, that would be great. Thank you. I'm also going to ask you a couple poll questions just to get a sense of where everybody's at today. So my colleague Ashley is actually going to put up a little bit of micro engagement for all of us to join in on. So the first question is, are you feeling lonelier than before the pandemic? Can you all take a moment just to fill out that part of the poll? And then the second question we have for you is, do the communities you belong or belonged to feel disconnected and less accessible? And then finally, I want to get a sense of your hope levels. Can we get back to being a city of neighbors? Okay, so some of the results are coming in. So about half of people are feeling lonelier than before, about the same, and 20% are not feeling lonelier than before. Communities you belong to are feeling disconnected. About 70% of us are saying that. So yes, that's in line with many of the findings we're seeing. And is there hope? Well, I'm already feeling very optimistic with 83% of you saying yes, there is hope. So thank you for that. It's needed. So as I said, I'm incredibly excited to welcome our guests today, which include Sharon Avery, who is the CEO at the Toronto Foundation. Yes, the very one who just released the Vital Signs report. And Jorge Amigo, founder of Be My Amigo and head of cultural programming at Vancouver Public Library. I'm going to welcome them on in a moment, but first I just want to offer a land acknowledgement. So today we're meeting virtually. You may not be on the same ground as me. I'm currently in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Mississaugas of the New Credit Territory. So instead, please join me in acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands we're on today to reflect on their importance. We must continuously work hard to understand the long history of these lands and recognize what those histories mean for the work of truth and reconciliation ahead of our shared work around democratic engagement in our communities. Land acknowledgements encourage us to think about the history that brought each and every one of us to where we are today. and to try to understand our place within that history. I encourage you to take the time to learn about the lands you call home and think about what you're doing personally to advance reconciliation in Canada. So now I'd like to welcome our guests. Welcome, Sharon and Jorge. Good to have you here. How are you?
Great to be here.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you for having us.
Okay, wonderful. So let's get right into it. Um, Sharon, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the findings of the 2023 Vital Signs Report and perhaps what you're reflecting on in terms of this loneliness epidemic.
Thanks, Victoria. And I guess I would start by saying that this is, it's been almost 20 years that Toronto Foundation's been putting out a vital signs report. And I'll be honest, like you start to feel like you're putting out the same information year after year. This report was unique in that it was preceded by a report we did in 2022 on social capital, which is a fancy way of talking about our relationships with each other, with our neighbors, with our friends, with our governments, with our police forces, with all the institutions that surround us. And that study really showed that in Toronto, and we did a national sample. If I see there's some folks from Calgary and Vancouver online, you want to see the national sample, I'll put it in the chat in a minute. That of course, no surprise, through the pandemic, our relationships are fraying. And so this year, when we decided to tackle vital signs, we felt strongly we needed to tackle vital signs in a very different way than we have before. And so we actually took an abundance of data from the study. We interviewed, 4,000 Torontonians, and never, the study itself barely scratches the surface. And so we decided to overlay the social capital lens on the rest of, on all of our quality of life measures. And so what you would find wouldn't be radically surprising to you, which is Toronto is not doing well. But what I love about the way we approached it this year is it does feel, you talked about optimism, and I too was heartened to see the results of the poll, that there are things that we individually, institutionally, sector-wide can do about it. But because you asked, I will give you the awful numbers first, and then we'll just talk about the solutions after. So Torontonians are now amongst the loneliest in Canada. 925,000 Torontonians report feeling lonely 3 to 4 times in the last week. It's an incredibly high amount. A few of you, it seems, are here today. I see some loneliness in the stats. Loneliness among high school students has doubled, and I know we're going to talk about young people today, Victoria. And that, of course, connects to mental health issues. So we're seeing 1 in 4 adult Torontonians reporting symptoms of depression, and 1 in 5 symptoms of moderate anxiety. So the connection between loneliness and mental health is very real. And we're seeing a percentage of people with 6 or more close friends has declined dramatically through the pandemic and over the last decade. And again, when we put an equity lens on all of that, of course, racialized, lower income, LGBTQ, disabled neighbors, they're the ones suffering the most. So it isn't a happy picture of how the city is doing. And so I'm delighted. I mean, I do think it is all connected. That sense of connectedness is really important for what we want to talk about today. I guess the last 2 data points I should give you that are really important to me, coming from a foundation who grants money to support causes across the city. We saw a 25% decline in donations in Toronto. And of course, you can only assume that all social service organizations, not just in Toronto, everywhere in this country, are at their maximum and getting less. And we're seeing a 25% drop in volunteerism in the city. And I mean, volunteering and joining are the ways that people connect. So that's just a flavor for what we uncovered in this vital signs, Victoria.
Well, thank you for sharing those stark numbers with all of us. I think it's really important to know those baselines so that we know that we need to, that's the call to action in and of itself. And that's also the key to making programs and initiatives that really answer these issues. I have 1 or 2 follow-up questions for you, if that's okay. Do you find that loneliness is manifesting as you might have anticipated in this report, or do you think the political context has changed conceptions of loneliness and belonging, and how does that ultimately impact our democracy?
That is a gigantic question that I only feel partially qualified to answer, but I'll take a stab at it. And I would say that it in the mix here, something that you don't have on our list to talk about, but I do think it's part of the play is the technical environment, the social media, and the way people are engaging with each other has fundamentally changed. And I think what our study is on social capital is showing that you can't actually replace human connection with social connection online. And so there's no question that I think we all went into the pandemic thinking that we could use our screens to stay connected. And not only does our data show that people didn't actually stay as connected with everybody in their life as they hoped they would that way, but that the quality of that connection was not the same. But then all of that extra time is spent being exposed to a narrative and a dialogue that gets very insular and very, like, we all live in our little technical bubbles, and often folks are hearing from people that sound and believe the same things they do. I think the other piece of this that we're seeing is when you're isolated, when you feel a sense that you don't belong, um, lots of folks, kids, young men especially, tend to get pulled into places that they do feel a sense of belonging in, and they're not always the healthiest of spaces. So I think all of those things are at play when we talk about loneliness and democracy.
Thanks for that. And I'm really excited to get into that gendered question a little bit later in the conversation. So I'll loop back to you. But Jorge, I'd love to loop you in now. So it's quite exciting that you wear a few different hats when it comes to this conversation. We know you lead cultural programming at Vancouver Public Library, but I'd like to dig a little bit further back into your past, to your early days in Canada as a newcomer, when perhaps things were feeling a little lonelier to you. I'm wondering if you can tell us about how you faced that in terms of your Be My Amigo initiative.
Yeah, happy to share. So I moved to Canada in 2007. I was a student at UBC, did my undergrad, my master's, and when you're in university, you have a network of automatic peers. You live on campus. It was easy to socialize. But then when I moved downtown, I immediately became lonely. I started finding it really hard to meet people, to build connections, and the more I talked to some friends or the few people that I met, I realized that a lot of people were experiencing the same thing, especially newcomers who didn't grow up with their social networks here. So I decided to lean on my last name and create a social initiative called Be My Amigo. And the idea of this, the general idea of the initiative was I would host these gatherings for strangers. And so I wanted to get strangers in the same room just to talk to each other. And so I hosted them at a series of restaurants or bars that had long tables. I would send out a call out on Twitter, put up an event on Eventbrite, everything was free. And then the mechanics of it were very simple. I would stand at the door for like half an hour waiting for every single guest to come in. I would introduce people to make them feel welcome to the table. I would provide some icebreakers. So if I knew that someone there was an architect and someone came in and said, "Oh, I'm a designer. Oh, look, here's a designer. You're gonna like chatting with this architect." So I kind of made it easy and welcoming for people. And then throughout the event, the next 2 or 3 hours of people chatting with each other, I would insert myself in conversations to play musical chairs casually. So I would tap people in and out when I realized they were stuck in a boring conversation or they might, be looking across the room wanting to go somewhere else. And essentially that was it. So yeah, it was a very organic type of gathering in the sense that people just came in to chat with each other, and I try to make it not as gimmicky as possible.
I love that. I love that you actually became a real life social convener for yourself and for your community. Can I ask a little bit, what was the public response and what were the kind of conversations that occurred over the dinners and social events that you held?
Yeah, so the public response was huge. In terms of online response, people really took to it. It got covered in all media. People were very excited that someone was trying to solve loneliness because it's this thing that people felt across the city, and it was a common conversation in Vancouver. And suddenly there was this random uh, Mexican who decided to, do this thing. And so in that sense, it was a really fun public response. I got invited to a bunch of things, to be a panelist and then an expert on community building because of it. Now, in terms of the response in the event, I think a lot of the people showed up because they were lonely, like they self-selected because they couldn't find friends, or they had just moved to the city, didn't know how to make friends. And so I think initially a lot of the conversations revolved around, they were very meta, they revolved around the fact of being lonely in the city and what it was about Vancouver that made them lonely. And I think that the positive aspect of that is that it allowed people who were lonely to find each other and realize that their experiences were not isolated, they were not unique. There was nothing wrong with them or their abilities. It was like this shared social phenomenon. So I think that by realizing that, it empowered people to seek out those connections on their own and to start thinking of creative ways to meet up. So what happened at the events was that a lot of friends or people who realized they had affinities, like some people care for the arts, some people were really into gaming, then they started self-organizing little groups from the event. So I heard all kinds of stories of people who then met at the event and then organized art gallery visits. Or there's a couple of attendees who realized they were both opera nerds and they started going on opera dates and then even flew to Europe to go see an opera together. So those
Oh,
are some of the stories that came out of the initiative.
well, thank you for taking that personal initiative. I feel like this is something that, it's simple and it's absolutely something everyone can do. And I hope that that inspires some people on our call. I'm also hoping to tap into your present role a little bit too. So just wondering more broadly about the role that you think public libraries play in community building and democracy more broadly as well.
Yeah, of course. Disclaimer, I'm here as a citizen. I'm not here as a spokesperson for the library or a representative of the library. Just here as a person who cares about libraries, who happens to work at one. I think libraries play a huge role in this conversation. I think libraries, as many people know, are some of the most important third spaces that we have. They're a critical part of our civic infrastructure, and I think they provide a connective tissue that enables like a vibrant, inclusive, multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. And it's important to note that we live in a hyper-consumerist, capitalist, transactional world where most places require you to buy a ticket or a membership or a coffee to participate. And to me, a library feels like an anti-capitalist exception. It's like this bubble where you don't have to buy anything to be there and to be welcome. No one's going to ask you to buy a cookie to stay. You don't have to show your ID. You don't have to have a specific purpose. And so that's in general, I think, what the role that libraries play. And in the case of the library where I work, Vancouver Public Library, the library has 4 strategic priorities, and one of them is belonging and connection. And so one of the 4 pillars of the library is to foster a connected community by providing opportunities for social interaction. And so the way libraries do that apart from the building as a welcoming space, libraries do a lot of programming, a lot. So the Vancouver Public Library does something like 9,000 programs a year.
Incredible.
3,000 of those are adult programs. In Toronto, I used to work at the Toronto Public Library. Toronto does something like 40,000 programs a year across the city, of which, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10,000 of them are adult programs. And so there's such a wide range of programs offered across the library system that they really manage to bring people together of different ages, cultures, income levels, and interests. And so in our case, we host all sorts of workshops, classes, cultural experiences, concerts, dance performances. And libraries partner with a lot of organizations across the city so that you tap into and you connect with different communities and specializations. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And those numbers are incredible. So if we really think about where hubs of connection are, it's absolutely the libraries. And Sharon, I saw you put in the chat that actually, as a result of that, that's where you decided to launch the report. Do you want to say a little bit more?
Absolutely. And it actually ties into, I just want to fast follow on a couple of things Jorge said. First of all, I'm very proud to say my 17-year-old daughter works at Toronto Public Library. And she is having the exact same experience and all these awakenings of what an important social hub the library has become. It is kind of the last safe space for anyone to feel welcome. And so to that end, we wanted to have the Vital Signs launch at the reference library. But interesting, it was a morning, we had a breakfast served, and a gentleman who looked like he was living rough came to our event. And there was this funny moment where I think library security, because we were a guest hosting an event, they thought they might have to, like security might have to get involved. And we were doing this exercise. I was on stage and we were doing a social capital building exercise where 300 people were introducing themselves to each other. And between my staff and one of our guests at the event, we're like, no, 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 no. He's going to stay and participate. And we got him breakfast, and he had an old copy of an old vital signs report in his bag with him. And for me, and I want to just reflect on your wonderful dinners, Jorge, because that is a brilliant example of the ways those of us that are able to do so can start to build connections together again, because these wise interventions. I've been obsessing over this book. I told Victoria and Jorge the other day, by Jeffrey Cohen from Stanford, called Belonging. And it's a whole book of science and interventions that he calls them wise interventions that build social capital between people really quickly. And one of the simplest things that you just did naturally, Jorge, is like admitting to others when you feel shy or uncomfortable or vulnerable in a setting. It is the quickest way to make someone else feel safe. And I think that that's why we chose to have it at the library. We wanted to pick the safest place where when people arrived, they felt truly welcomed in a space that represented everything we were hoping to represent.
I love that story. Thank you. And I think it's just so telling too that, you didn't stigmatize maybe someone who might have been otherwise kind of surveilled by security or questioned for their belonging in that situation. And I think what's even more telling is that they had a vital signs report right in their bag. So I think, how can we again be good neighbors? How can we destigmatize others and find ways to extend those branches? And I think we were talking a little bit about this in our time before we got on the call. It's about the muscle memory we have of being a little bit exclusive during the pandemic. We were actually told, only have a few small people in your social cluster. I think people were afraid to make eye contact on the street during the pandemic, and socialization and was actually dangerous. So how do we decrease that muscle memory, in your opinion? Jorge, what do you think?
Can you repeat the last part?
No, I was just saying that, like, during the pandemic, we were socially conditioned to be exclusive, right? And to have small clusters and to not be kind of friendly and
Mm.
extend those kinds of olive branches. So how do we get out of that muscle memory?
It's a tricky one. I think that partly, as Sharon was saying, is to just create spaces that feel welcoming and inviting and exciting as well. Um, I'll tell you a story about how the pandemic shifted my programming because I think it's relevant to this. When I was programming in Toronto, I was doing for the library there a lot of literary programming and ideas programming with high profile people, um, showcasing the hottest books that were getting published at the time. And then I moved to Vancouver in March of 2020. And I started my job on March 23rd at 9 a.m. and I got laid off at noon,
Oh my gosh.
3 hours later. And so I was laid off for 6 months because of the pandemic. And during those 6 months, suddenly every single major institution in the world got into virtual programming because people everywhere suddenly had access to the best authors and the best ideas and the best panelists constantly. And so you didn't have to be in Boston to watch a panel conversation in Harvard. You didn't need to go to Paris to watch a talk by someone at the Louvre. And so that clicked something in me, and I realized, oh, I need to rethink when I go back to work, who am I programming for? And what's the effect that I want to have in programming? And it completely changed my approach. So I realized that as a programmer for a public institution, my role is ultimately to bring people together. And yes, in my case, I do it through ideas and cultural experiences. But the bigger goal is how do we get as many people together and from different walks of life, not just cater to, a niche literary audience. And so I started seeing myself more as a connector and someone who helps people with similar affinities and curiosities find each other and then discover other things that they might care about. So it's almost like it widened the scope of who I thought I was programming for. And I'll give you specific examples. I try to provide more entry points to people. And so um, I realize that I'm working every single day in this wonderful, beautiful building, a palace for the people, as Eric Kleinenberg would say. And it's also an amazing music venue if you see it as a music venue. We have all these spaces that could become musical venues. So I started organizing concerts, and I realized, wait a minute, music is something that a lot of people don't have access to because they can't afford a ticket to the symphony or a concert. They don't feel comfortable going to those spaces. They don't know how to dress for those spaces. They feel embarrassed, or they simply don't know where to look. A lot of people don't realize a certain type of music is happening in the city. So why don't I interrupt their day at the library by putting music in front of them? They don't need to find out about it. It will just start to happen. So I started organizing opera events, symphony concerts, violin concerts, percussion concerts, all sorts of things that happen in the middle of the day at the library. And part of the idea there is to just allow people to have a moment of levity, of delight, connect with each other. And what I've seen in those events is that neighbors start chatting with each other because it gives you an automatic icebreaker. You're in this space, no one's talking to each other, and then there's a beautiful violinist playing there. Well, maybe someone will lean over and ask and talk to each other. Someone will be carrying a book and they'll ask, "What are you reading?" So that's sort of how I've been doing it. Another example is during the pandemic, we saw an 800% increase in anti-Asian hate incidents in Vancouver, very alarming. And so I realized, well, that's something the library should be addressing in some way. So I got together with some, Asian community leaders and decided to launch a series of programs to celebrate Asian cultures, but also address the issues of racism. So we formed an advisory group and we came up with this thing called Upliftation. And the whole idea of the series is to uplift Asian voices, but also to expose everyone in the city to a diversity of Asian diasporas and the issues that these different people are facing through literature, through music, through poetry, and through discussions of the actual racism itself. So that's
Yeah, this is exactly how you build that connective tissue and build that empathy so that strong communities and ultimately strong democracies can be built. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Sharon, I think similarly, you're seeing, you have this incredible opportunity to have a bit of both a hands-on approach, but a bird's eye view of really incredible work that's being done to really strengthen our democracy. And so I'm wondering if you could also tell us a little bit about the Power of Us grants that Toronto Foundation is currently administering, and just give our community builders here some ideas about other learnings and program design that really speak to building back up our democracy.
So I think what everyone's hearing as Jorge gives his examples and we talk about the power of us and our work, I think what we're collectively realizing in this work is this isn't like radical innovation. This is intentional connecting. This is creating spaces, big or very small, that are different. For me, I've started like talking to people in elevators again. Right? If I'm in a lineup at a coffee shop and someone catches my eye, I've been trying to start conversations. I've been just practicing my muscle. So just back to your original question, Victoria, like some of this for those of us that are able to do so, because we have lots of folks that are racked with issues that they might not feel comfortable doing what I'm suggesting. But if you are someone who is willing to just put themselves out there a bit, boy, the rewards are a beautiful, beautiful thing. So start small. And that's what we started with Power of Us. So the other difference with Vital Signs this year is we added a campaign, Volunteer Week's coming up in April, and we asked kind of our stakeholders, our partners, our grantees. We have a lot of donors and fund holders at Toronto Foundation to consider doing one act of civic optimism, but in time for Volunteer Week, just one. So again, like that one small step, what that looks like. It could be, one of my board members, he's actually a fairly young guy. I think he's in his early 50s, took up curling with his 80-year-old neighbor. And I can't even tell you, like, Jorge, you would love this because you don't need any gear for curling. You could just go to curling. And it's an intentional social gathering of 80-year-olds and my board member in his 50s. And they they draw names, and everybody draws for their team that night. And then they sit and have a beer with 3 new people each night. And he is loving it because he's hanging with these seniors who have all these amazing stories to tell. And he's like the young guy in the group. But that's, that's a Power of Us act. And so you mentioned, Victoria, the grants. So we offered, with Volunteer Toronto, we partnered up and offered a grant stream so that if someone wanted to do something maybe that involved some cost and they couldn't afford to do it otherwise, you could apply for micro grants. And so the kinds of things we're seeing, because we're literally, after we spoke about this last week, Victoria, I was like, I got to find out where we are. We're in the middle of like starting our first review. And the kinds of things that are showing up, like someone's offered, not unlike Jorge's Amigo idea, a neighborhood dinner party. We have people setting up after school homework clubs. We have folks, a lot of park activations, clean up parks, planting community gardens, all kinds of things like that. Because I think sometimes we get distracted by big, you think these ideas have to be big and visionary. And we're saying that actually, we've been through a lot collectively, and coming back out the other side, it's a bunch of us doing a lot of little warm, welcoming, inviting things that will start to bring us back together. And I know, Victoria, like you're aiming this towards like, well, what is that? Any of that got to do with democracy, right? But we know the research shows that people that engage in their communities directly, they have a higher quality of life than those that don't. And the quality of life of their whole community rises the more connected that community is. So that's really important. I think the third piece of that, the sort of third leg of that stool, is if you are connected in your community and you have a community of people that you're used to working with, then engaging in civic issues, lobbying for a change in your neighborhood, voting, participating in the political process, all becomes so much easier. And because you've warmed up, you're using, I'm going to use your muscle analogy, right? You've built up that muscle, and you have a tribe to come with you, and be a part of that. And so for us, it may seem really simplistic, but the call we're making is, if you are able to start re-engaging, go back out and join your local soccer club or your right now hockey shimmy, go back and I'm auditioned for a choir, right? Like let's get back out involved, back out and connecting, on a day-to-day or on a once a week basis. Just start joining in on the power that is us together.
Thank you, Sharon. I think that was really powerful. To your point, I think a few things we can start to kind of catalog is that we know that all democracy is local. So engaging in those local acts, building that connective tissue, starting to have dialogue around basically anything can absolutely lead to the kind of working through our communities as political spaces as well, having political dialogues, making decisions together, and actually having a shared vision for where people go next. I want to
I
flip
want to
that switch. Oh, sorry, go ahead,
I
Jorge.
want to add to what Sharon said. Well, the first thing is that as she was saying that beautiful story, the sun came out in Vancouver for the first time in 2 weeks. So you did
There we
something.
go.
And the other thing is that the program you're describing is very similar to what Vancouver ended up doing about this loneliness epidemic. So in 2012, the Vancouver Foundation published a report that found a similarly disconnected city. And the city, it was at the same time as Be My Amigo came on because, and that's what allowed the initiative to grow. A very good timing. And the mayor launched an Engaged City task force. So he got 22 citizens to spend a year trying to figure out how to tackle isolation. And one of the things they came up with was this neighborhood small grants program that gave $500 to people who wanted to do local initiatives to bring people together. And so I think just very quickly, the biggest lesson that I had from Be My Amigo, and perhaps one of the reasons I stopped doing the event, is that I realized that for us to fix this, we need a city of conveners. Like we need conveners in every block. you need
Yes.
people in every block that are willing to do that all across the city. And then additionally, and we can get into it later, but we need an urbanism that supports that kind of space.
Mhm.
Car-centric urbanism is not going to give us those, you know, casual, spontaneous interactions. So
No, I think you make an excellent point, and, I think that's a really strong call to action. What I wanna do now is actually flip the switch a little bit on all of the excellent things that we are doing and talk about maybe where we're struggling. And so, Jorge, I actually wanna ask you a little bit about the trust gap. So, in addition to all of the health implications that we're hearing about and other kind of barriers to, being together and combating loneliness, we know that there's a link between loneliness and what's happening in the political arena. So the team and I have done a lot of work on polarization in the last year. So I'm just wondering, what you think is the connection between a lack of belonging and declining trust, not just in our institutions, but in one another as a result of polarization. So just wondering if you can speak to the trust gap that we're experiencing.
yeah, I feel that ultimately what I heard from people is that a lack of belonging makes you feel inadequate, that there's something wrong with you. And so
Powerful.
you're more susceptible to feeling alienated from the structures of society that make decisions that affect your life every day. So if you don't feel like you belong in a place, you're not going to show up at your local mosque, church, or farmer's market. You're not going to see your neighbors. You're not going to get to talk to them. And I think that's important because we live in a profoundly unjust and unequal society. A huge proportion of Canadians live paycheck to paycheck. They suffer from housing insecurity. Most people I personally know cannot afford to save or are one rent eviction away from having to leave the city that they grew up in. And
Mhm.
so if you pair that sense of desperation from our economic life with, well, you don't regularly talk to your neighbors and you don't feel like you belong, well, you don't realize that other people are feeling the same and have this are facing the same social injustices and are also worried about the future. So you miss this massive opportunity for building solidarity. Like inequality should lead us to solidarity, should lead us to see the other and be like, we need to fix this because this is messed up. But instead, when you don't feel like you belong, you don't seek out that solidarity because you don't talk to each other. So it opens the door to feel like, wait a minute, maybe institutions are not there to take care of me. Maybe the government doesn't work for me. And then you become suspicious of politicians, of bureaucrats. Maybe you start thinking that they don't have your best interest in mind because my material conditions are not changing and I don't see them doing anything about it. And so I think I have to add that that is particularly true in a society where people who are racialized are disproportionately targeted and singled out by authorities, either by carding on the streets or by followed around in a store if just you're just not white. So I'll
Yeah,
leave it
thank
there.
you for that. Actually, one of our guests just wrote into me, and Jeremy, I see your question. We're absolutely going to get into it in the Q&A, but he actually just shared a profound comment that said, "When we're all struggling, then everyone is a threat." And I
Yeah.
think that's actually really profound. Sharon, I really want to get your take on this as well. So, as we've been talking about, trust is the social glue of our relationship. So, how did trust feature in the report, and your thoughts more broadly? And how can we kind of get back to basics when it comes to earning trust? Because this is one of the central foundations of our democracy.
So I'll start with that question first, and I'll go back to the report in a second. I do want to just quickly say, in violent agreement with what Jorge just had to say. So the next step after you're feeling completely like you don't fit and don't belong, then you are easily trapped into different ideologies that make you feel like you belong, and not to obsess even more over this new book that I'm reading called Belonging. Um, you know, one of the key interventions for a sense of belonging is, and I love this idea of a city of conveners. I've been thinking so much lately about our foundation staff skill set around facilitation and facilitating a sense of belonging, but it is a city of conveners I'm looking for, who understand that by being willing to be vulnerable yourself with someone else and saying something. I can imagine I go to all of these evening events where I don't know anybody. I'm usually pretty comfortable with it, But, you know, I can imagine lots of people aren't. And walking up to someone and saying, you know, I find these things really make me nervous. Will you stand with me for a minute? Is one of those examples of a simple intervention that fundamentally shifts a sense of trust between two people. And so I think for us, you know, you had asked a lot of questions earlier about mental health. We see a lot. So you assume that the isolation and loneliness exists with seniors, and it does, but it really exists with young people. And so when I think of trust, I also think of optimism. And so one of the things that most concern me as the mother of a 17-year-old young woman is that it is our young women who are struggling the most. That 38% of high school students are reporting poor mental health, and female students most especially. The fact that we have a massive learning loss of students, like when I think about the generations to come, what we don't want is this trust deficit to grow. And I think the other piece that's quite unnerving is the sheer number of people talking about leaving, not seeing themselves in places like Toronto. Before we got on the call, Jorge was talking about Toronto as being a very welcoming city to him. I don't know that people coming to Toronto today, or who've grown up in Toronto even, feel like Toronto is going to welcome them in the future. And it isn't so much a cultural gap as it is an economic one. And so the intersection between the inaffordability of the world right now, and you talked about it, paycheck to paycheck, and the mental health and the loneliness, that we're seeing in our research a drastic drop. I think it's like a 25 or 30% drop in a sense of optimism about the future. And our young people are typically, for years, always the ones in the data that are optimistic, and they are not.
You know, it's interesting that you say this, and the word hospitality really resonates with me because I heard someone describe it the other day as an overabundance of service and care. And so is Toronto and are the cities and spaces in our nation more broadly really operating on that principle? I think that's some food for thought. And the other comment that really comes to mind is when we think of ourselves as having a social purpose of being conveners, are politicians really doing that across the board, or are they just kind of stoking the opposite? And I think we probably have room to just go in one more direction, and then we have to go to questions. But I like the gendered analysis we're taking. And we spoke about young girls a little bit, but I also want to make sure we speak about what's happening with young men as well. So essentially, this isn't a new concept, but I do think it's becoming a bigger feature of Canadian life. Um, Hannah Arendt actually talks about it in her Origins of Totalitarianism. She talks about how nationalist movements produce isolated people who are then more vulnerable to nationalist ideologies. And that makes me think of, what's happening with young men rallying around figures like Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate. And so, Jorge, maybe we can start with you. What are your thoughts on how young men their loneliness is kind of being preyed upon in this way?
That's a huge question.
Sharon, I'm coming to you next. So I'll give you a moment to think about it too.
I mean, I think that the fact that young men are taking life advice from a cage fighter and a pseudopsychologist has to do with, I mean, their grievances are being exploited for engagement by the biggest advertising machinery we've ever seen, right? We have these tech platforms run by billionaires who have figured out a way to essentially radicalize people for profit. And they have all the incentives to do that. And so we're up against one of the biggest forces and an undemocratic force, right? Our governments are not stepping up to regulate these tech platforms. They're not stepping up to provide counter messaging. And so to me, what I see is when you're isolated, you feel like you don't belong, and suddenly Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson is providing belonging and rage because you feel angry and they're validating your rage. To me, the problem, there's two things. There's no counter narrative that feels legitimate to you. Like the government is not investing millions of dollars in providing different messaging to men about healthy masculinities. The government is also not going out and shooting itself in the foot by saying, yeah, we know we've created an unjust society, and everything you see as markers of success on your social media you're not going to get it. You're not going to have that car. You're not going to have a house on the beach. Don't worry. But still be happy. So I personally think, I mean, that's probably the diagnosis. And what can we do about it? Like I said, I think if we're not willing to regulate the way that these messages are coming into our lives through our phones and through technology, and if we're not willing to roll out massive public education campaigns, then I mean, I don't think we're ever going to be starting to scratch the surface of this problem. Um, Two quick things that I would say is, as low hanging fruit for solutions, is I wish the cities invested more money in just hiring icebreakers or public conveners. Like literally hire people in every single neighborhood that are the big brothers of that block, whose role is to make life fun and exciting in that city
I
or in
love
that
this idea.
block.
Love it.
What? Imagine if you took a chunk of the police budget and instead you gave it to icebreakers. You literally call a bunch of people the icebreakers of your community, and then provided more public spaces for that to do that. So the very brief story I'll tell you is, and I'm gonna lean on what Sharon said about me being happy in Toronto. Like, part of the reason why I felt so like I belonged in Toronto was because of a conscious design choice that people made generations before me, which is I lived in a very walkable neighborhood of Trinity Bellwoods, and I had two parks within a block from me. And I happened to meet a guy who organized a thing called Monday Night Bocce. And every single Monday for 5 months in the summer, 4 months, he would just show up with a bocce set at the bocce courts in the little park by my house. And whoever showed up, showed up. And sometimes you would have 30 neighbors, 30 people, 40 people show up, have beers, talk about life. And so just that little intervention. So it was an act of design and programming and just generosity from this neighbor. But it was also the fact that some city planner decided, oh, maybe we should have rows of houses right next to each other where the length of the door to the sidewalk is not too far so you don't feel isolated, but you can actually talk to your neighbors. And then there has to be a park every 2 blocks so that people have a place to convene and feel safe to talk to their neighbors. So there's a variety of choices that I didn't make that suddenly made my day-to-day interactions in Toronto
More
very
connected,
welcoming. So
more
I wish that for most men in young men, that if they had that kind of environment, physical environment, but also social environment, I'm not sure they would fall prey to the Andrew Tates of the world as easily.
I think that was brilliantly said. Thank you. Sharon, I want to get your sense, and then we do have a question from the audience, and I'd love to encourage all of you to write in with your questions now as well, and maybe even just some of your ideas as what's been sparked during this conversation. But yeah, Sharon, what are your thoughts on this?
So I was going to say, Victoria, I'd be really interested in those listening if they've had ideas as a result of what we've been talking about. I would love to see them in the chat too, because I like to take ideas to the next conversation. On young men, so I would say a couple of things. One, we were deeply involved in the van attack in Toronto. We held the Toronto Strong Fund, and so that young man and his incel experience was a big eye opener. I think it opened our eyes collectively to what's going on. What are these niche communities of men, and what are they talking about, that I think we all felt kind of collectively naive at that time a few years ago. And I also know that the research also shows, and this is good news, is that well, the bad news is when young men feel lost and need a sense of belonging, they will join things that aren't good for them and aren't good for their societies. We know this. Jorge covered that beautifully. The good news is that if they can be attracted in those environments, the gang environments or whatever that looks like, tend to be quite autocratic and generally speaking not that fun in the end. Like there becomes a disillusioned point. And so what they show is that if you can actually attract young men into other things that are like a bocce on a Saturday night or in the park or in a different kind of club, or a different kind of environment where they do feel safe and belonged and respected and a part of something bigger than themselves, they will shift. We just have to be intentional, right? We have to be really intentional. I am totally loving this idea of block by block city conveners, Jorge. Like, what a great thing for us to support, right? That would be so neat to try out in one neighborhood.
Yeah, it's like you have the infrastructure that exists already without having to reinvent the entire city, but it's unprogrammed.
Yeah.
So
Well, let's build it.
So let's program it, right? Like
Build that
I'm thinking of
icebreaker.
like big condo developers, right? We have a number of them that were partners on our social capital work. Maziar Mortazavi and Taz Design, and also Northcrest for Downsview, right? They are doing a 30-year neighborhood building plan, and they supported the social capital research because they want to figure out how to make their neighbors neighbors.
Yeah.
Imagine if every condo had a convener as a full-time or a part-time job, right?
Yeah,
This is
yeah. I'll give
um,
you a quick example, Victoria, on that. I had a friend here in Vancouver who is similar to being my amigo, realized, well, we have all these beautiful public spaces, but they're very boring. The seawall, there's nothing on it. People are just like on spandex running around. And so he decided to start a guerrilla dinner series where he would text 100 people and say, okay, in 2 hours, we're meeting at this place and show up with something to eat. And so
potluck.
it was a massive potluck in public, but everyone was welcome. So imagine that in the middle of a park or a sidewalk or a place, suddenly you have all these people sitting around, hanging out, having a great time, and they tell you, come, yeah, there's more food for you. So it can be simple acts of programming like that. It doesn't have to be like this mega
Yes.
concert program.
It can be totally simple. And I think that, I'm so grateful of all of you providing so many great micro examples. And that's the point, that they can be micro and they make a difference. We actually have one really interesting question that came in through the chat. And it's, a conversation barrier actually that Jeremy is asking for some help on. He said, do you have any suggestions for how we might change the old tradition that we do not discuss politics in polite company? Is that a social norm that needs to change in order to help improve democratic institutions across the board? Who'd like to take that one?
Can I go first?
Yeah,
Because I've been
absolutely.
talking about this nonstop. So just last week, we had a gathering of community foundation leaders in Southwest Florida, in Fort Myers. And we wanted to gather there because it is the hotbed of Republican, like whatever's going on south of the border right now, right? It's 2024 is just such a terrifying year from a democracy standpoint. And a group of us wanted to go down and find out what the Community Foundation of Southwest Florida was doing and how they were being so successful in such a really toughly polarized environment. And it got us all talking about the fact that, yes, politics is a taboo subject and no one's supposed to talk about it. And it is the only thing that we should be talking about right now. And this fact that we are missing these skills to actually have these conversations anymore. There was a time when, bipartisan politics was a real thing. Like guys disagreed, largely they were men at the time in parliament, and then went and had beers together afterwards. They could respect each other. And I agree that we should be talking about it again. And I also say we're not very good at it anymore. It has become an either or. If you don't agree with me, I'm justified in being violent back to you. Like it's gotten very, and so going back to the convener idea, like that's the other thing the reason I'm reading this book is I want to know what are the skills we're missing that we could be sharing and teaching in community to allow communities have healthier conversations as well.
I think there's a kernel there. I actually read an article saying that if we can validate kernels of one another's perspectives, then that's actually a way to be able to connect, because you're not going to disagree with everything someone is saying unless it's purely hateful and antisocial, in which case, obviously, there's no room for that. But if we can say, I understand where you're coming from, or I've noticed key elements of this as well, generally people get their backs down a little bit. And just one other piece, really appreciative to Jeremy Wright for his comments in the chat. He just was weighing in on the piece about men. He just wrote, I think the important part is to make men feel validated as well, especially with media coverage on patriarchy, decolonization, and social reconstruction makes it so that young men feel under attack for simply existing. As I found out after working construction for 15 years, the best way to connect with toxically masculine individuals is to validate their struggles and show them that they do matter and that we do in fact care about their well-being, make them feel loved, and they open up. Society doesn't love young single men, and that needs to change if we don't want guys to lose men to Trump and Tate. So I think that's actually a really powerful
So
statement.
well
I
said.
love
Yeah.
that. So I
Yeah.
love what he said, and I'm going to piggyback on what Sharon was saying, in that when you start a conversation about politics by positioning yourself in an identity, you immediately alienate your opponent. So there's a guy called Jonathan Smucker. He's a organizer. He actually was at the Democracy Exchange a few years ago. And the nugget that I want to bring to you here is he works to bring people together across the political divide by explicitly avoiding labeling people. He doesn't identify as a Democrat. He doesn't identify as a liberal. So if you start a conversation by saying, "Hey, do you think we should earn more money per hour?" That's very different from saying, "I'm a conservative and I like fiscal responsibility," because you've already ossified yourself in a position and in an identity. And research shows that if you present two groups of people or a group of people with two different policy choices, they will they'll choose A. Let's say they believe a certain thing about taxes. But if you then present the same choice by saying Democrats think that or Republicans think that, their answer is completely different. We humans, we tend to answer based on our group affinities, not based on what's good for us.
Right.
And so I think that to answer that question about how do we have these conversations about politics, make sure that when you're opening up a conversation about politics and talking to men, you don't immediately go to things that mark you as an identity. Like, don't use, if you identify yourself as a feminist, well, the other person might have a very particular idea of feminism that they react against.
Right.
But if you talk about the core value, so talk about the
About what
values.
matters, right?
Yeah, talk about what
Yeah.
matters. It allows people to have those conversations, and they have them about ideas, less about identities. Conversations about identities don't go anywhere.
I think you make a really strong point. I actually would love to invite John to join us for the last 2 minutes of the conversation because, the work of the exchange really started a long time ago with the simple question of asking people what mattered in a way to kind of get them, to your point, opened up about talking about community and talking about democracy. So, John, before, I want to say thank you to Sharon and Jorge so much for honestly these brilliant insights and for sharing so much personal and professional and how they come together. And John, I'd love to give you the final words so you can say thank you to our guests as well.
Yeah, well, thank you again, Victoria, for pulling this group together and leading this conversation. Lots of like aha moments in there and keen insights. But because at the core, democracy is about having vibrant and inclusive communities and building community from the ground up. Because if we don't have that, then we can't disagree, right? Because we're not going to agree. Like democracy is how we disagree and then make decisions. So I think that's like acknowledging that is critical. And the work, Sharon, that you're leading and Jorge, you're doing, is critical to that foundational piece. So just a quick plug. And if you guys can hear, my dog is speaking in the background. I'm not sure if you get that, but my dog is here also wanting to be part of the conversation. Yes. But it's and so if if you are anybody here is interested in joining together and being part of a solution-oriented approach, please plug. We're having our second annual in-person Canadian Vote Summit in June, where we're going to dig deeper on these questions about the impact of loneliness. How do we build community? What's the various impacts of social media has come up here, the impacts of new technologies on community and democracy. So check out, I'm sure everybody here hopefully has access to our website at engagedemocracy.ca. But I think also to Sharon's point and Jorge's point, that like join groups, do things in your community. I know a lot of folks on this group here are doing that, but continue those small acts and the big acts, and set up your bocce group, and just have your pop-up potluck. Those kind of acts are core to democratic engagement, right? Because then we can have a conversation with somebody that talks about, oh, well, we have a different take on this world, or we see things differently, but then you have the trust established to allow those conversations to move forward, and we can all do that. So thank you. both for being here, and thank everyone for joining on the call. And look forward to seeing everyone at our next Democracy Dialogues and at the Canadian Vote Summit. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.